Okay, folks, good afternoon. I think we have a critical mass online, and welcome to the Black, Brown and Green Irish Voices series here at Glucksman Ireland House at New York University. My name is Dr. Miriam Nyhan Gray, and I have the pleasure of hosting and moderating today's event. This is our last Black, Brown and Green Voices series for this semester. We'll be picking them up probably in February. We have a little bit of a winter break in the January season, so please keep an eye out for information on our spring programs. We're absolutely delighted to collaborate with some wonderful institutions with this series. In particular, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at New York Public Library, the African-American Irish Diaspora Network, and of course, we're always grateful for the support that we receive from the Consulate General of Ireland for New York, not New York University alone. And we will have our Consul General, Kieran Madden, who has been a really great champion of this work, speaking shortly. So today you're here for my chat with Brian Dooley, author of Black and Green, The Fight for Civil Rights in Northern Ireland and Black America. This is the republication of it. You'll see in our social media, we also circulated the promotional information of the original red cover. It had Bernadette McCalskey and Angela Davis on the front. And this is the republication. I'm the proud owner of 2 copies of it now. Someone who's actually here on the line gave me a gift of this last winter, which made me realize that it had actually been reissued, and Brian and I are just maybe going to talk a little bit about that of course as well. So just by way of introduction on Brian himself, Brian, prior to joining Human Rights First, he worked in the United States so he worked for US, Irish and international NGOs. Most recently, he led Amnesty International's work on partnering with national NGOs in the Global South. He has also worked as head of media for Amnesty International in London and in Dublin. And as Director of Communications for Public Citizen in Washington, D.C. He is author of several books about civil rights and US politics, and he has early experience on the Hill, interning for Senator Edward Kennedy in the mid-1980s as legislative researcher, contributing to what ultimately became the 1986 Anti-Apartheid Act. Before that, he lived and worked as an English teacher and community organizer in a black township in South Africa, 1981 to 82, which was prohibited under apartheid's racial segregation laws. Brian has an MPhil in government and politics from the Open University in London and a BA with honours in political science from the University of East Anglia. Brian, you can hear me loud and clear there from London?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. Great, wonderful. Before I open up our chat and invite people during that to post some comments, I'd like to hand over for a brief word of welcome to our Consul General for New York, Kieran Madden, who is zooming into us today from, I believe, the consulate. Welcome, Kieran, and thank you for being here.
Well, it's a virtual consulate. Thank you, Miriam. It's my living room, but we stick the flag up to make it look the part. Look, as ever, I'm delighted to be here for another in the Black, Brown and Green series. The consulate is just delighted and honoured to be part of supporting the series run by Dr. Miriam Nyhan Gray and by Glucksman Ireland House. I know we have some regulars on these calls who turn up for this, who are part of these discussions on an ongoing basis, and that's fantastic. As you will know from previous ones, the consulate got involved or tried to get involved in this work of creating a better understanding of African American and Irish American connections about 2 years ago. But then I look on the screen and I see Lenny Sloan, who's been at this work for 30 years or more. And of course, then your speaker today, Brian Dooley, whose book Black and Green was published, I think, 22 years ago. So I'm a Johnny come lately to this, and I'm primarily here to learn. There was an event yesterday, a virtual event in Georgetown on transatlantic relations, and one session focused on John Lewis and John Hume, both of whom the world lost this year. And John Hume, there are many plaudits we can put in the way of John Hume, and we run out of time. But one thing he does get credit for, and rightly, is the internationalization of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And that the beginnings of that is often traced back to his meeting with Ted Kennedy in Bonn in 1972. That was how America was introduced to the Troubles, and ultimately became part of the peace process and was an important mover in the peace process. And he brought the Northern Ireland to the attention of Europe as an MEP. But as Brian's book goes into in great detail, the inspiration was far earlier than that, through the civil rights movements. And it was a different contribution. It was a contribution of inspiration, a contribution of the inspiration of how to affect change, how to fight for rights through nonviolence. And Brian would know far more than me, and I wouldn't dare tread on territory where I know far less. But there's two illustrations of how embedded that was. In 1997, Alban McGuinness became the first nationalist mayor of Belfast, and it was the day before, a year before the Good Friday Agreement, and in his office there, he hung on the wall a poster with Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. And when he finished his term, it was moved back to SDLP headquarters. And then scroll on a couple of years post Good Friday, and John Hume was preparing his Nobel acceptance speech. And I understand it from talking to people around him, the first speech, the only speech he reached for in preparation was Martin Luther King's own acceptance speech. And he ended his speech there with, "I will now end with a quotation of total hope, the words of a former laureate, one of my great heroes of this century, Martin Luther King Jr. We shall overcome." And that's how John Hume finished his speech, accepting the Nobel Peace Prize. And Brian, I'm looking forward to learning more about this from Brian, but there's a chance that inspiration isn't known, that inspiration in Northern Ireland and the impact of it isn't as widely known as it should be. If you visit the African-American Museum in DC and you go through the horrors of the stories of slavery in the United States, and you reach the civil rights movement, at the very last box there is the international influence of the civil rights movement, and Ireland doesn't feature. And now, look, my daughter mocks me because I want to find the Irishness in everything. Okay, and I'm paid to do so. But the impact of it was so huge that I think it is a story that we need to tell more of and tell better. And as Miriam pointed out, the person who can tell it a lot better than I can is Brian Dooley. So I'm honoured to be here to listen to him. I mentioned him before. I wish I could get him in person and take him for a 7-hour lunch and pick his brains on Northern Ireland, but also on the Gulf and South Africa and Ted Kennedy and much more. But I'll settle for what I can get today, and we look forward to doing this in real life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kieran. Always great to have you with us, and thank you for sharing your insights. Really great. Brian, if I get, I'm going to start a little bit with a perfunctory question in a way. This, if I'm correct, Black and Green is published in 1998, an important year retrospectively in terms of what happens, presumably, and I'm pretty sure from our conversations, you'd started the research a little bit earlier, but can you tell us why and how you wrote this book?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Kieran, too, for that. I will tell you, I have to say, I was looking forward to doing this all day, and I wasn't at all nervous until I saw suddenly there's like hundreds of people here, including some people I know out of context. Elsa, Des Harney, who I was at school with, and I haven't seen him since. It's putting me off a little bit. Anyway, I wrote the book, and look, you know, as I get older, I think when all else fails, the best thing is just tell the truth. And so I'm going to tell you the truth. I don't know if it's the most impressive answer, but I wrote the book because I had written a book a few years before, political biography of Bobby Kennedy. And while I'd enjoyed writing it, it was pretty academic, and I felt pretty limited in the language I could use and the story I want to tell, really. I was in my 20s, and I think I was striving a bit hard to be taken very seriously. So I enjoyed it, but what I wanted really was the freedom to write another book that I really wanted to write. And I was sort of searching around for a few things, and I came across a footnote in a historical journal. A mate of mine, Brian Ward, had written something, I think, in the Journal of Southern History or something about Martin Luther King and his influence actually on the civil rights movement in Britain. Martin Luther King was given an honorary doctorate degree by Newcastle University. And my friend Brian Ward had written a short essay about that. And in the footnote, it said, you know, the influence of King in Britain has been underdeveloped, but in his influence on the north of Ireland, you know, really hasn't been looked at all. And I had known a little bit about that context. I'd worked as a journalist a little bit during the Troubles, albeit from England. And I'd known, because of the work and the study I'd done around the US in the 60s and the Bobby Kennedy book, that there were these two pieces of a much larger story, but two pieces that I was vaguely familiar with in terms of I'd read a lot of books about both. So I wrote the book really because I wanted to. It did take a long time. And, you know, kids, before the internet, it was really a slog, right? The internet sort of been invented, but there really wasn't anything on it. And so my weekends were spent, you know, taking a train up to the newspaper library outside the very north of London and, you know, slogging away in there for 6 hours, perhaps getting one or two quotes. So, you know, it was a hobby and it took me years. So you're right that it came out in 98, but I really started writing it probably in 94, 95. Chance encounter, I was in Belfast on my way to a funeral, my uncle, and in a bookshop, I ran into Bernadette Devlin McCalliskey and I said, look, I'm thinking about writing this book. If I did, would you talk to me? Because like, if you don't, it's going to be hard. She said, yes. So anyway, I won't give you a minute by minute account of what happened between 94 and 98, but it took me a long time and it's a pretty short book. And I did have the freedom of writing it in the way that I wanted to write. I wasn't being funded by anybody. You know, there were no strings attached like that. I didn't have to do it for an academic qualification. It's pretty short. Frankly, when I got fed up writing it, I thought, well, that's it. You know, surely that's long enough. And I sent it to the publisher and they said, no, it's not long enough. You'll have to pad it out. So at the back of it, anyone who's read it, these are sort of ridiculous little potted biographies of everybody from Rosa Parks to Jerry Adams to John Hume to Eamon McCann to God knows who else. And really that was just to try and bump up another 5,000 words. So I wrote it because I wanted to. I really enjoyed writing it. And I'm sort of, you know, delighted and astonished anyone cares 25 years later.
So can I ask you, Brian, and we chatted a little bit about this last week, the positioning of the Irish in Britain is different. You know, all these things are culturally specific to, for example, the positioning of Irish America, in as much as we can, you know, group them under these big categories that, you know, obviously don't encompass everyone. And so you're writing from a British perspective, we're guessing by your accent, but with an interest in Ireland. Will you tell us a little bit about your background in that vein, in as much or as little that you being someone of Irish descent from Britain, researching or getting interested in this topic may have framed it?
Yes, I've never really thought it through that way. I certainly have never considered myself British or writing from a British perspective. I was born and brought up in Britain, but only ever identified as Irish, legally, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, whatever you want. But certainly the experience of someone like me, as in of my age, who was a teenager in the 70s and 80s, was very different from, you know, someone born in 1963, growing up in the US, you know, being an Irish American, if you like. I mean, you know, the Troubles was, I guess, more pronounced in London. You know, we would hear bombs go off. My dad worked as a postman. His friend had his fingers blown off there sorting letters. We weren't living it in the way that people in the north of Ireland were living it. Of course we weren't, but we were much closer to it. I mean, physically, and I guess intellectually, than many in Irish America were. So as far as that's relevant to the Black and Green book, I guess it's a bit different in that, you know, I wasn't embedded either in Irish America, certainly obviously wasn't embedded in the African American community in any sense, or in the north of Ireland. So maybe that semi-detachment from those things helped. I don't know really. Honestly, I hadn't really thought about that much before we spoke.
And I guess I suppose not it gives you a particular perspective in that sense, because you're writing from the outside in that sense, so it gives a particular perspective. You start off with, you know, I've said this to you, Brian, it's a small book, but it's full of it's a really great I don't know whether primer is kind of an insulting word to use in terms of describing it. Like, you cover a lot in a short space of time, and the first chapter really kind of fleshes out the historical context of some of those relationships. To your point, in terms of undertaking this research kind of pre-internet, were you mainly able to research, you know, Frederick Douglass's time in Ireland and all these different elements that you kind of flesh out early on? You were able to do all that in the UK?
Mostly in, you know, at the great London libraries. Also, I spent some time in the north, and then I can't remember, 96, I think, to 96, 97, I moved to the US just coincidentally for another job, and managed then to get my hands on not so much materials, but contacts for people. I mean, again, the great freedom of writing a book the way you want to is that, you know, you can focus it the way you most want to do, and partly because it was the cheapest way to do it, and partly because it was the way I was most interested in doing it, I wanted to talk to people who had been, you know, living it. I mean, so I was writing it like in the mid-90s, and say the people from the north of Ireland who were living that, you know, that was 25-ish years before. So a lot of the book, in terms of research, is based on meeting people who had been active during that time, and listening, and then, you know, retelling their stories. Both in the north of Ireland, but also some African-American civil rights activists, Angela Davis, some people from Martin Luther King's organization, the SCLC, who went to Derry immediately after Bloody Sunday, and so on. But for the very far back stuff, like the Frederick Douglass 1840s stuff, clearly, you know, there's no one alive to talk to then. And so that was just going through a slog, I guess, of academic work, although it was all, you know, new to me. Honestly, I'd known a bit about the influence, or thought I knew about the influence of the American version of the civil rights movement on the Irish version. What I hadn't known, when you backtrack it like 50 or 100 years before, and without oversimplifying, the influence was really washed across the ocean the other way. So, you know, Frederick Douglass massively influenced by the struggle for Irish nationalism. Marcus Garvey, 1910, 1920, massively influenced by the not so much embryonic but early stages of Sinn Féin and Irish republicanism. And then it flows back, although the Montgomery bus boycott, of course, you know, used a tactic which was established, named, invented, developed by people in Mayo in the 1880s. But then by the time you get to the 1960s, in the north of Ireland, the association there, for various reasons that people deliberately want to make, is claiming that, I suppose, credibility, legitimacy of what's seen as, you know, the good guy fight of association with the African-American struggle for civil rights of the 50s and 60s.
The book was reissued in, I think, 2019. Brian, I think, isn't that, did we settle on that being the date? Because I got this copy last year.
I don't know, to be honest, last year or the year before, yeah.
2018 or 2019. It's, as I understand, it was reissued in its original format, right? And I know, as a scholar, in terms of things we write, and our thinking sometimes evolves or new information comes to light. Are there things in the book that, if you had the opportunity to tweak or revisit, or, you know, just the passage of time, so much has happened since 1998, right? I mean, you probably didn't foresee what was, you know, going to happen in terms of 1998 itself even being so momentous a year, even at the time. What would you change, or what do you not like about the book now when you revisit it, or is there anything?
Oh God, yeah, there's plenty I like. It needs a whole rewrite, and when it was reissued, I didn't know it was going to be, so it's sort of nice. But you know, that I really scratched the surface on so many areas which, you know, other people either are looking at now or have looked at in the last 20 years. For instance, just that relationship between Irish America in all its layers in the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, I spoke about that a little bit, and its relationship with the civil rights movement in the North. But you know, Melissa Baird at Queen's University is getting, you know, neck deep into that in a way that I never did, and it's brilliant. So you know, if I could write the book again and had resources to do it, I'd go into other areas much more deeply, many areas that I only spoke about. I mean, first of all, a lot has happened since '98, right? You've had the Obama presidency, Obama going to Dublin, giving the speech about Frederick Douglass. You've had all sorts of archives open, which weren't available to me. You know, the internet basically is also managing to host loads of stuff from the University of Southern Mississippi. Has got an oral archive now, which just wasn't there 25 years ago. RTE, the Irish state broadcaster, has a fantastic archive of all this stuff. So that's newly available. There's also an awful lot of stuff which I just didn't really know about. You know, I wrote as much as I could forage and research in the mid-90s, but I don't even think there's a reference to the Harlem Renaissance in my book. And if there is, you know, I certainly can't remember it. And yet there was really a pretty close relationship culturally there between the Harlem Renaissance and the Gaelic revival of Ireland of sort of 10 or 20 years before. So plenty stuff, you know, either I didn't know about or that has happened since. I'm a little bit glib, to be honest, when I'm throwing away on words like slave and slavery. I certainly would be far more nuanced now, knowing how politically charged that is, and that nonsense debate about some Irish Americans claiming, you know, a legacy of slavery. So, yeah, I'm glad I wrote it, and I think it more or less holds up a quarter of a century later. But yeah, if I was rewriting it, there's plenty I'd change.
Brian, you're careful implicitly. I know, you know, you make reference there, and I appreciate you remarking on that, on the usage of the term slave or slave, and how you would do that differently. But you are careful. You know, one of the things that I don't think you're trying to do, and you know, one of the dangers with comparative work is that you're trying to kind of, you know, make narratives similar in ways, and you're careful about, for example, not diminishing or downplaying the brutality of the slave trade and its consequences in comparison, for example, the movement of the general thrust of emigration of, say, people from Ireland to the United States. In other words, that there is kind of a hierarchy, or you know, to be careful not to flatten out the experiences, right, in ways that diminish then the actual lived realities of those experiences. Do you know what I'm trying to say, Brian?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, even 25 years ago, I got that. I mean, there is no real comparison. I think when I was talking about slavery in an Irish context in the book, it was to point out that culturally, without any reference really to the American experience, there is a strand of identification with the notion of slavery in Irish history. I mean, St. Patrick, written Irish history really begins with St. Patrick, who was a slave and who escaped slavery. You know, I think the word slave is mentioned in the Irish national anthem. I mean, this has nothing to do with the African to the US trade, right? Mm-hmm. I was just pointing out there culturally that it's embedded somewhere in the Irish psyche too. But that's not a major part of what I speak about. Most of what I talk about really, again, as a function of who I managed to talk to in person, and who was prepared to talk to me. So the meat of the book really is about what happened in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s.
Yes, that brings me nicely, Brian. We didn't set it up that way to my next question, though. The heart of the book. How was, with the benefit of, looking back over 25 years or your reflections now, it seems like you got pretty expansive cooperation or interest or participation by certain key players. Tell us a little bit about that experience of essentially doing what we call oral histories to kind of form the meat of the book. Is that right?
Well, one thing, yes, it is right. And one thing I've been thinking, reflecting on when I complain that people, young people don't realize how difficult all this was before the internet. But in a sense, I found it was easier in that, I've written books before the internet and then one after it. And I think, although it was more difficult to find people, there was a chance encounter with a key player in a secondhand bookshop. But I think people, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I don't think anyone said no to me when I asked if I could interview them. And maybe that was because they weren't getting inundated with 10 emails a day from researchers everywhere asking them. So although it was difficult, to find a phone number or a fax number for some people, I don't think there was anyone I asked to speak to, right from, I'm trying to think really, I think Austin Curry, when I spoke to him, was a minister in the Irish government. There are other people who basically retired. There were other people, Angela Davis, was super busy, but everybody I asked to speak to said yes. And so for me, the process of writing, actually, tip-tappy in a way, is sort of fairly interesting, but what's much more interesting is meeting people and asking them about their recollection. So you can call it oral history if you like. I never really thought about that. I'd never had any training in oral history. It was just exciting to go and meet people in person who had done this stuff and lived this stuff.
And Brian, can you convey a sense of, in both directions, when you were interviewing about Ireland, going westwards and westwards, eastwards, what was the texture or feeling or consensus in terms of how one group viewed the others and their participation in those realms? You know what I mean? The kind of the texture, or the kind of was there a lot of warmth? Was there, could you describe that? Or
I guess, but so when you're doing a project like that, I think necessarily sort of a little bit obsessed with it, right? And so anytime, anybody from one of the contexts mentioned something about the other context, that was all like super exciting and like gold dust to me, right? And so that would be really the conversation I'd have. So if I had a conversation, let's say, with one of the student leaders in the 1960s of the civil rights movement in Ireland, Michael Farrell, right? But really all I'm interested in that 2-hour conversation with him is asking him about the connection with the influence of John Lewis, of Snick, how he saw those similarities. And, he lived enough of that context, he knew enough, he remembered enough to really, give me a couple of hours. It was just about that. For him to tell me how that fitted in the whole wider panoply of the civil rights movement, that wasn't the book I was writing. Mm-hmm. And so finding those connections, was just what the book was about, and it was very focused. So for instance, when I spoke to African-American activists, again, there's no point in having that conversation about the 1950s and 1960s generally. It was about their trip to Ireland, or the connection with somebody from the Irish civil rights movement they've met.
Mm-hmm. There are questions coming in, and I'm anxious to make sure we have plenty of time with them. Maybe we'll move to some audience questions, but I might pick back up with Brian again. One here, I grew up in Belfast in the 80s and 90s. The different communities tended to be quite insular. You're an Irish person with a British accent. Did you find that to be a barrier when you went into the nationalist Republican communities?
Oh, that's a good question. So I didn't remove any note of surprise in my voice that there was a good question, but that really is a good question. Yes, often, and only momentarily. Like there was a bit of a, why do you sound like that? And then, you know, once you get like 3 minutes into the conversation, then it's all right. I mean, in this context, both of writing this book and then, you know, other journalism stuff, I'd covered the Bloody Sunday quite a lot as a separate project over the years. I'd done a fair amount on some of the big miscarriage of justice cases in Britain of the Guildford Four and the Maguires and the Birmingham Six. And you know, yes, the accent is just a little off-putting for some people, but nobody was the least bit off or hostile or any of that, you know, once you get beyond the sort of the third sentence of explaining what you're about.
Mm-hmm. Were you aware, Brian, of Paul Robeson Jr. and his link to the late Paul O'Dwyer here in creating a Labour civil rights coalition that has stood the test of time?
So this is one of those things which I could have and should have known about and didn't. So yes, I am I aware of it now? Yes. Was I aware of it in the mid-90s? No, or it would have gone straight in the book.
Yeah. Lenny Sloan, who Lenny was our first Black, Brown and Green interviewee in April. He pulled, I don't know, he's asking me or you, I think it was earlier in our conversation. That was an interesting remark about identity, which brought out questions about how where you are impacts on who you are and how you think. Please expand. I guess for my point in terms of getting to it, I was trying to get a sense from you, Brian, which I think you've conveyed, in particular for American audiences or people not familiar with the ways in which Irishness has played out in different ways in terms of diasporic communities. You came of age in a particular time in Britain when being of Irish background was not always the easiest identity to carry, right? In terms of wider things that were going on and how they may have made you more attuned to perhaps the struggles of other communities in other places. You know what I mean? I guess that's where I was kind of coming from in that question, which you've kind of explained in terms of your background. And I don't know whether you agree or disagree with me in that sense.
Sort of. I mean, I think that may be overstating it a bit, but yes, I do think that, you know, growing up Irish as I did during those years was a different game to growing up Irish post-Troubles.
Yeah, or Irish in different places at the same point in time. Perhaps I guess I'm kind of overstating or like lingering too much on the comparative dimension, but I do think it's interesting. So does the African-American civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s continue to impact on activism today? That question came in by email as well. Thank you for following up by chat. Do you have a sense, Brian, as to how much what happened, say, in the 50s, 60s in particular here has been impactful? I think the answer is yes, but you share your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think it does, and way beyond Ireland too. I mean, you know, that in my normal job now has been, you know, for a generation now, for 30 years, I've been working in some sort of international human rights context, and I see sometimes a very simplified version, but nonetheless, people drawing on the experience of the American civil rights movement. Again, you know, partly for a sort of a legitimacy, a credibility, but also I think partly to explain their own struggles to an international audience. So, for instance, you know, one area of the world that I've worked on a bit in the last 10 years is North Africa and the Middle East. And again, of course, because I've got my antenna out for it, but I see repeated references in those struggles to what happened in the US, and you know, not confined necessarily to Martin Luther King. I mean, there's plenty there. Associations with the Black Panthers. I did a lot of work in Hong Kong over the last year, and the posters and the iconography there on the street put up by teenagers in Hong Kong often made reference to Malcolm X. I remember reading a couple of super astute pieces from a political prisoner in Bahrain, Zainab al-Khawaja, writing for the New York Times, and very deliberately and smartly citing in a very thoughtful and pretty deep way the philosophy of Martin Luther King. So I think that still resonates both in the north of Ireland, and there are connections there still. For instance, I think someone else on this called Kate McCabe, and she's involved with an exchange from the Free Dairy Museum and the Hush House Museum, an African-American museum in Detroit. But certainly the influence goes way beyond the north of Ireland into other areas too, where people want that credibility, they want that association. If you walk into, well, the NGO has been closed down now. There's a fantastic feminist organization in Cairo called Nazareth for Feminist Studies. And I remember the first time I went in there, they got a massive poster on the wall of Angela Davis. And, first of all, I did a double take. And then, of course, like, this is exactly where you would expect that iconography.
Brian, you identify some of the people you interviewed for the book, but not all. Someone has asked if you got to interview Gerry Adams. I don't think he's listed, and I don't know whether I think some of them were done on the assumption of anonymity, so you may or may not be in a position. I don't think he's listed as one of the people you interviewed.
No, he's not listed because I didn't interview him.
Okay.
And earlier I said, and I think this is true, I didn't ask anyone who turned me down, but it also doesn't make sense I wouldn't have asked him. I just don't remember, honestly, asking him. I assume that I would have, but nor do I remember him or them saying no. I mean, again, he was pretty busy those days, right?
Yeah.
Tying up the truce. But I didn't interview him. I did interview, other Irish Republicans. Actually, those who were most, there were a couple of people who were very insistent on their anonymity, and they were from the police force, from the IUC. A couple of those spoke to me about how ill prepared they were in terms of training and so on for trying to police large-scale civil rights marches, and that they were sort of complaining that the hierarchy within the police force, which has now been reformed somewhat, really had sort of left them unprepared, untrained, and when all those images that you saw of police battening the crowd, the former or current, I think they were current policemen who spoke to me, sort of blaming the lack of training and the lack of equipment, and that's not how we would do it these days. But anyway, those are the people who are most insistent that I didn't tell anyone about their cooperation with me.
Right, fair enough. Kevin has asked a question. Kevin Kenny, our director, did you write the book you originally intended to write? In other words, did you begin with a vision of the argument and follow that through, or were your preconceptions sometimes radically changed by the interviews and in particular the circumstances of the mid-1990s?
Honestly, I wish I could remember. I tell you what, I thought I was writing a book really about the 1950s, 60s and 70s, but that was really becoming from, a pretty deep place of ignorance, not really knowing much at all, I think, about Frederick Douglass. I don't think I had any idea that Marcus Garvey was in that picture. I had very little idea about any of the cultural stuff. So yes, the book changed in that it although, given that it's all pretty surface level, I mean, I think there's only 6 or 7 mentions of Marcus Garvey in the whole book. But it went about 150 years, whereas really I thought I was going to write it about 30. And as far as the direction, yes, I'd like to think that I was sort of open to, not having a formula and trying to make those stories fit into it. But really the richness of it, as I say, is, the conversations that you have with people and then picking out the most interesting stories from that. So I guess that's what shaped it really. The experience that I heard from those people from the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm. Brian, there's a long question here, but one is worth posing. Do you feel there are ongoing parallels between grassroots civil rights activists in the United States and Northern Ireland and their failure of their respective states to address ongoing human rights concerns and issues? For example, the lack of a federal response to date to ensure the rights of African Americans in the United States, and the failure of both Stormont and the British government to address ongoing rights issues such as Acht na Gaeilge, the protection of the Irish language rights in law.
So short answer is yes, absolutely. I think there is. Many of the concerns, struggles on both sides of the Atlantic in those contexts are still real, not least accountability for past violations. Clearly, many examples on both sides of accountability for the past, but I still think beyond that, clearly, I mean, obviously one of the big things that's happened since I wrote the book is the Black Lives Matter movement, and issues there around police reform, the sort of weapons that police use, the oversight of police. They are, in one sense, very similar to issues which were around in the north of Ireland in the 80s and 90s, but which haven't gone away. And so, yes, in terms of that structural frustration, many of the things are still similar. I mean, North of Ireland is a way better place than it was 30 years ago, obviously. I hope I don't need to say that. But many of the things which we would class as human rights issues, civil rights issues, are still problems. I'd also say, if I can take it out of both of those contexts for a minute, and again, because of what I've seen elsewhere in the world over the last mostly 10, but also 20 years, I also see similarities between between other struggles which go beyond the comparison of African-American civil rights activists and those in the north of Ireland. So, for instance, whether it's people looking for human rights, civil rights in North Africa or the Gulf or Hong Kong or Ukraine or wherever else that my work's touched on, I see a lot of similarities there, not least in the internal friction within the movements. I mean, I've yet to see a human rights movement that does not have some sort of tension inbuilt within it around gender issues, around age issues, around issues of experiences of those in big cities as opposed to rural communities. And so those things were not just, I think, commonalities between the US and Ireland, but I think that, I don't know about they're universal, but they're certainly very common elsewhere.
Brian, do you have any thoughts on the transatlantic connections between the adversaries of both civil rights movements, i.e. people like Ian Paisley and Bob Jones?
Yes, so this was also something which I can't remember having much knowledge about at all before I started researching the book. And I mean, I said horribly nerdy, but really very excited. I remember I was in the brilliant library, for those of you who don't know it, in Belfast, called the Linen Hall Library, and going back through some of the newspapers. I mean, I don't mean, microfilm, I mean the real newspapers. The Protestant Telegraph was a newspaper which Ian Paisley had, who was a sort of an anti-civil rights figure, and finding that he was on a trip to the US during the early part of 1968, where he had a sort of a pretty reactionary white supremacist fan base, much of it around the Bob Jones University. Paisley was in the US when Martin Luther King was assassinated, if you're looking for a new conspiracy theory. But actually, wrote back there saying, basically, King has, played with fire, or he who lives by the sword, some nonsense like that. Whereas the rest of the world was like united in grief about King being killed. Paisley was a bit finger wagging and a sort of, you know, I told you so, it would come to this once you inspire people to, you know, rioting, this is where it ends up. Again, it's an area which, you know, I find some interesting things about it. I'm guessing maybe there's 8, 10, 12 pages on it, but clearly it is rich for a much deeper dive, because there were more than anecdotal engagement and relationships there, which I think, you know, has continued for some time since. I'm no expert on loyalism or the far right in the US at all, but certainly you see some engagement between the two during that time and since.
Brian, excuse me, someone has asked us, I guess it's credit to us that we're this far in, and the word Brexit is percolating. Do you, someone's asked you, excuse me, to comment on Brexit and its impact, in as much as it is relevant, or it is relevant, but would you like to respond to that in any way?
Sure. I don't know that it's that relevant in terms of that relationship that we're talking about, you know, in the comparative histories between those two contexts of the US Civil Rights Movement and the Irish Civil Rights Movement. Before you all came in, and Kieran and I were doing a bit of the small talk there in the chat, we spoke about Brexit, but again, this is more back to the identity question of, you know, with people like me, second generation, growing up in England or Scotland or Wales, I guess, during those years, you know, there was just a lot of explaining you had to do about why you said you were Irish and what did that mean, and did you support terrorism and the blah, blah, blah. And then that thankfully faded away, and that sort of identity became much more expressed in, you know, which soccer team do you support, or when Ireland play England at rugby, who do you support? Much safer ground. Mm-hmm. But now it's gone into a slightly more politically charged context again, where Irish people who sound like me are getting passports, Irish passports. And again, there is a sort of a suspicion, a bit of skepticism, cynicism by some people that they're doing it. They want to be Irish because of the European passport it brings. So in terms of that identity of politics, it matters. I'm not sure it particularly is relevant to the African-American struggle for civil rights, although if anyone sees that it is, that'd be great.
You know, you mentioned there, Brian, that you interviewed in the course of the research some people involved in policing. Do you think that policing reform in Northern Ireland gives lessons for the American context?
I do. I mean, it's slightly outside of my comfort zone. I mean, not so far that I won't, you know, give an opinion on it. It's also, let me say, to prefix what I'm going to say, one of those areas also that I see relevance in other places in the world. So in Hong Kong, for instance. Now, Hong Kong, you know, basically since June has been sort of taken over direct rule from Beijing, really. But for the year before that, there were some hopeful conversations, which also included the possibility of police reform. And one of the contexts that people were looking at, formally and officially, was what happened to the police reform in the north of Ireland in the 90s and early 2000s. Without getting too boring about it, which was really based on recommendations in something called the Patton Report, but which in itself drew on the Kerner Commission from the US in the late 1960s, which had been a root and branch, very thorough investigation into disturbances, including riots in 67 and 68, some of which the recommendations there were about police reform. Now, in both of those contexts, both the American early 70s reforms and the reforms in the north of Ireland in the late 90s and early 2000s, that was mostly around, not mostly, but a lot of it was around the recruitment of respective minorities into the police. And I think that we've seen over the last few years, you know, the problems are wider than that, that you can still have systemic racism in a force which, you know, may have great representation of African Americans in it. It's an experience which I also think is transferable elsewhere in the world. Bahrain, a lot of the problems there are because the security forces are drawn really from one sect. Again, not exactly like Northern Ireland, but many similarities there, that you don't have a police force which is reflective of the community it serves. So I'm meandering a little bit, but the question originally, you know, are there lessons around police reform? Yes, absolutely is the answer, about the weaponization, about the accountability into past abuses, and about the personnel, the makeup of the police.
Brian, we're coming towards our time, and we have to have you back to talk about more on this and more on your other book on, in particular, on the next generation, second generation Irish born in Britain and stuff like that. But when you wrote this book, you were writing about a Northern Ireland, and indeed an island of Ireland, which is pretty racially homogenous. You were writing about, you know, mainly white people in the island of Ireland, and the African-American context was obviously not like that. Ireland, north and south, has changed quite significantly demographically, in terms of the representation of peoples of African descent and from other places. Just kind of following up by Ted Smith's question, which if I can find here, I had it. Irish identity is more diverse. Are you hopeful that we are making progress towards a post-racial society in Britain and in Ireland and the United States? That's a big question, but I guess, you know, reflecting on the changing face of Ireland in some ways.
I'd say I think things are changing in terms of the demographics, although I also think that, you know, those demographics aren't entirely new, but just weren't really weren't researched or written about. I mean, the idea, you know, and again, I don't think I say it explicitly, but my understanding 25 years ago, when I was writing about Irish America, would have been an overgeneralized group of white people, whereas I'm sure 25 years ago there were Irish Americans who did not identify as white, and certainly now there are Irish Americans who aren't all white. So yes, although I think that, you know, the reality of the demographics is different, I also think that it's not like there weren't any. The Irish America was always white, and suddenly now it's not anymore, and same in Ireland. As to whether things are getting better, I don't know. In some ways, absolutely, but, you know, I mean, you don't have to look very far. You don't have to look very far to the past. I mean, as in a matter of days or weeks ago, to see there are still massive systemic problems in the US.
I'm going to park now trying to get to all the questions because there are too many coming in for me to get to. But as a kind of final question for me, Brian, you know, you've touched on this a little bit, but just to finish, close us out a little, from the vantage point of 22 years later and the kind of revival that this book has gotten since it was reissued and stuff like that, how has that experience been for you?
Very odd. I mean, great, but you know, unbeknownst to me too, when I wrote the book, there was something else going on in the whole world of academia, of history, which I had no idea about. But turns out, totally coincidentally, that the book I wrote was an early example of something called transnational history. I'd never heard the term, and only heard it actually fairly recently. But the sort of revival that the book is getting now is partly because it's being used in academic circles as an early example of this transnationalism, where you don't see history as being confined to the experience of one country at a time. And so this comparison that I was doing was apparently newly fashionable, although I didn't realize it for, till 20 years later. So partly that's, I think, why it's getting a bit more attention. Also partly just the issue of this connection either side of the Atlantic is now getting more prominent, which is great. I mean, statues of Frederick Douglass are springing up all over Ireland. Fantastic. And I think that's helping to feed this research. And as I say, whether it's Melissa Baird at Queen's or others are taking on this academic research now in a way that I never did, much better, much more in depth. And I think it's being recognized as being, such a rich field of politics and history that's relevant to today.
Yeah, and Brian, I've said that, I said this earlier and I said it to you before, it's very readable, as someone who specializes in doing books with, or writing things with a lot of footnotes. You do have some footnotes in it, but it's not bogged down in that, it's very accessible and you get through a lot. And it really is, I mentioned this to you recently, you have a little bit on Marcus Garvey and the influence of Irish nationalism on that, in that kind of late 19-teens period in the aftermath of the Rising and stuff like that. And I, for one, unbeknownst to myself, I had read your book ages ago and had forgotten you had touched on that. And I've just spent a number of months drilling down into that research in a more systematic academic way. I think more people will pick up a book like yours than will perhaps read the more it's really the dedicated scholars that might commit to the more in-depth research, but you pull together so many threads really well. And I'm really honored that you took the time today to come on to talk to us about Black and Green. Again, the subtitle is The Fight for Civil Rights in Northern Ireland and Black America. It's published by Pluto Press, and it's actually a really nice Christmas present for people. By virtue of you being on this call, this is actually a nice holiday gift for people. Not that Brian asked me to plug it in that way. Brian, I hope, I really, I'm sincere in following up on what Kieran said. I hope that you're back in New York at some point soon, and we can have another conversation with you in person and have a chat with you about the themes in this and your other work. It's really amazing work that you're doing, and thank you for being a great ambassador for the Irish in this vein, and for contributing to the Black, Brown and Green Voices series with us.
Thank you very much for having me on. Honestly, I'm astonished that so many people are like semi-interested enough to listen to what I wrote 25 years ago. It's fantastic. Thank you very much. It
was great, Brian, and thank you. I'm sorry that I didn't get to all the questions, folks, and please tune in the spring and be safe, everyone. And you too, Brian. Great to chat to you again.
Bye-bye now. Thank you.
Thank you.